Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are running the fourth of our Masterclass sessions on developer-first security and accelerating the same. I have with me today Larry Maccheroni, DevOps transformation expert from Contrast Security. Larry, say hi, quick intro.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And we are due to get James McKinley, Head of Cybersecurity Innovation, Managing Consultant at Affinitus Global, joining us as well. But although we are in contact with him, he's having problems getting into this session at the moment. So I think we will move ahead. We've got a packed agenda. James McKinley due to talk on the software supply chain risk and opportunity. Larry Maccheroni on getting DevSecOps right, and myself will then pitch in with some customer stories, shifting smart, not necessarily shifting left, which is often talked about now. And then we'll drop into a Q&A panel at the end, and your feedback and input on that is very welcome. Feel free to raise your hand, raise questions, use the Q&A, etc. as we go along, if you do have anything, or save questions to the end. We also have a couple of polls to get your feedback and input on as well. With that in mind, Larry, are you ready to share and swap yourself and James around?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, let me just stop sharing. Larry, over to you.
Collapse this. Down here. Okay, that should be full screen now.
Yeah, we've got that. Thank you.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can shift left, how you can adopt developer-centric application security, or if you want to call it DevSecOps, we can call it DevSecOps. I've drifted away from that term a little bit, even though it's literally in my title at Contrast, because there's a bunch of connotations to that have been added by the industry that I don't quite agree with. So I'm going to give you my version of what I would have thought DevSecOps should be. So one of the challenges of doing this shift left, where is mindset, is basically the way you think about things has to change in order to get there. And so let's talk about a few of those things. The quote on the screen here is from Gene Kim, and I like to refer to Gene as the godfather of the DevOps movement. He wasn't the only person to launch it, but he seems to be sort of like the most wise leader of the movement at this point. Excuse me. So the quote there, any improvements made anywhere besides the bottleneck are an illusion, is really, I think, powerful. And we're going to get into here in a little bit what that means. But it boils down to one of the three ways of DevOps, which is flow. And that is the one that this quote is essentially targeting. So another mindset thing that I think I'm going to throw on the table here and we can think about is that we constantly are looking for the latest and greatest tool or a new movement for champions. We're constantly moving to advance the state of the art, but often what's lacking is the state of the practice. It's so far behind at this point that it's not even valuable to advance the state of the art. The state of the practice, the way it's actually done, is maybe a decade behind the way we say it should be done. So coming up with better ways to say it should be done is not really that beneficial. And so that's sort of goes back to the Gene Kim quote of any improvement made besides the bottleneck is an illusion. And that is that we're constantly trying to improve the state of the art, and we're not improving actually the way it's done. And you don't get benefit out of new tools and new techniques unless you change the way the processes and the attitudes and the culture around those things. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about that, how you do change that culture. And here's an example of sort of a thing that we do wrong. So the latest craze now is to share SBOMs. So the federal government in the United States has mandated that any software provider to the government must provide us software bill of materials when they provide that software. The problem is that the people receiving that software bill of materials, don't have any way to make sense of what they're seeing. It's very difficult to make sense of what they're seeing, and to the point where they can actually protect themselves. And I think that's the intention of the SBOM sharing, but it doesn't really work out that way at this point. The software changes very rapidly. It's very hard to keep up. The vulnerability landscape changes very rapidly. So even if the vendor provides you with a new SBOM every time they update their software, if the known vulnerabilities in the world increase and happens to overlap with that software, you need an update to the SBOM for that reason as well, even though the software is exactly the same. The attack landscape changes, so even the priority can change, right? So if it's something that's not being attacked, it might be low priority, and if it later becomes attacked, it might be high priority, and that's important information to know. Now, we can do it for the extreme things like log4shell, but it's much harder to do in the whole. And the bad guys are looking at every possible way to attack you. Then there's this concept of reachability. So just because you have a library that has a vulnerability in it doesn't mean that your software actually calls that vulnerable part of that vulnerable library. And so the recipient has no ability to do this analysis. The vendor does have ability to do this analysis, but the SBOM doesn't require that they do it. Enterprises lack good inventories of the versions and pieces in use. So just because I know that a version of the software that a vendor has provided has a particular vulnerability in it, doesn't mean I know every place in my environment where that software is used. Now, with phone home kind of capability in the software, and in SaaS software in particular, software delivered as a service in particular, it's actually a lot easier for the vendor to know where you're using their software than it is for the customer to know where they're using their software. So I'm not completely down on SBOMs, because I think creating an SBOM is something that you should have been doing for years. We didn't call it SBOM, though. We called it Software Composition Analysis, or SCA. And this has been for a decade or more, this has been a tool category. And so you should have been processing this and using these tools. And the first step of using a software composition analysis tool is to generate an SBOM, and then to do the analysis and the prioritization and everything that the recipient has no ability to do up here. The vendor should have been doing for maybe a decade now at this point. And so as soon as they're required to share their work, they might start doing that stuff that we've been telling them they should have been doing for a decade. So honestly, I don't care what's in a vendor software. I know this sounds a little extreme. I don't want to know the details of what's in their software. I just want to know that they have a robust process around it using these SCA tools that assures that they never ship with a vulnerability. And if there's a later change in the vulnerability landscape, I want their processes to be able to update rapidly and inform me rapidly so I can do any update work on my side, et cetera. And so I want that robust processes on the vendor side. And I think SBOM sharing might shame them into this a little bit more. But I don't think it's actually going to provide direct benefit to the recipients like it's envisioned right now. Another mindset concept I'm going to talk about here is this definition of DevSecOps. A lot of folks think it's just DevOps lipstick on a traditional security big. You can keep doing security the way you were. Let's just call it DevOps now, or DevSecOps now. It's the same thing we've been selling for a decade, but now we're going to call it DevSecOps. And that's not my definition. And so I have this definition for developer-centric application security, otherwise known as DevSecOps or Shift Left. And it's all about empowering engineering teams to take ownership of the security of their software. Now, we need to make sure they're worthy of being trusted with that ownership. And so that's where the whole concepts of transformation come in. And that's what I specialize in and help with. But one of the key concepts in that transformation is we want to do it in the DevOps way. And Gene Kim and others made this easy for us because they published the 3 ways of DevOps. Flow, feedback, and a culture of experimentation and learning are the 3 ways of DevOps. And I have a whole talk about sort of what these mean in the space of DevSecOps. It's really perfect fit for what we need people to be doing culturally, and to actually shift to advancing the state of the practice to catch up with the state of the art. But the one thing we can never forget is that we're here to deliver value to our customers in the form of software. And so anything we do have them do needs to not slow that down. It needs to make sure it actually improves the value that's delivered to the customers. And that sounds like a trade-off, but it's not. The more you adopt DevOps practices, the faster you can go and the more you can deliver value rapidly, and do it in a way that's actually more secure and of higher quality. So the first thing you need to do when doing this, when trying to transform your organization, is you need to identify what those changes need to be. And I call these changes practices. And so the most common way I see people sort of try to pick the practices that they're going to try to shift left or push out to the developer community is by borrowing them from places like NIST or SANS or OWASP or PCI. And NIST and SANS, are still pretty bad. OWASP has this 400-page older AppSec guidance, but they have a newer guidance that's actually more aligned with me. That's a few pages. And then PCI has this PCI 4 custom mode. And so PCI 4 hasn't been adopted yet, but it's coming. And so PCI 4 actually is aligned with what I'm about to say. But the traditional forms of all 4 of these are not very good at this. And so first of all, they don't say the same thing. Sometimes they even provide conflicting guidance, but most of the time it's just different guidance. They target security specialists in both terminology and approach. They fail to specify how a developer should do this instead of how a security practitioner should do this. They're way overwhelming, and this overwhelming part is really important, because if you see a list of 400 things you need to do and you don't know which one to start on, you just give up, and it's too daunting and you don't do anything. But if you see 1, 2, or 3 things to do, then you can get started on them. So in order to achieve that list needs to be prioritized, and they're not prioritized. They're just a big bucket of everything you must do, and it's way too much for anyone to actually do anytime soon. They fail to consider your unique context. So not only is it not suited for developers, but it's not suited to your company. They're not tailored to your company. So instead, what I suggest you have to do is you have to create your own list. And I help organizations do this by hosting a workshop. I just did this publicly last week in Charlotte. I had all the big banks that are headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, et cetera, all in the room. And I helped them come up with their own list of developer first practices. And the workshop approach to doing this is really important, because it allows them to engage with the developers and actually see where their thinking might be sort of missing the mark with them, talking past them, using terminology they don't understand. So what I do is I bring the 3 to 5 most influential developers, most respected developers into the room for the workshop when I do this at a company. And I had a few developers in the room when I did it publicly last week. And they're going to represent the developer community. And not only that, they're going to help create this list. They're going to help create a new policy manual for, to use a phrase that maybe you wouldn't want to use at your organization. But in essence, when I do this, this becomes the new policy manual. And the policy manual sort of survives for a few years. At least it did when I did this at Comcast in its old form, as something sort of like, oh, well, the traditional AppSec folks use that, but the new way of doing it uses this instead. We come up with this list of practices together in a room using Post-it notes collaboratively. And we make people sort of come up with their own set in private, working for 10 minutes all by themselves at a desk and coming up with their own post-it note version of the critical practices they think development teams should be doing. And then we put them up one at a time, one card at a time, one post-it note at a time. And what this causes to happen is conversations. So I'll see that a developer put up a card over here in something that development teams could do, and the security people put up a card, a security person put up a card over here in the list of things that they want security people to keep doing after this transformation. And I'm like, well, why do you think developers should do that? And why do you think that security people should do that? And I caused that conversation to occur in the workshop. And that's really the key to actually shifting their mindset. And then the other thing that comes out of it is the security folks are like, well, you should just do it because the way we do it. And the developer's like, no, that's not easy for us to do it. We need it to be automated. We need it to be fast. And so the security group comes out with a to-do list to get the easy button for things. And then we actually use this on real development teams. We try it out. We ask them if they are able to adopt these practices. And that learning sort of evolves the list of practices over time. At first, you sort of need to do it several times in the first few months. And then after that, it's kind of a once a year update kind of thing. So once you have this list, what do you do with it? Well, you have to get the development teams to adopt it. And so I use this concept of coaching. And so my favorite coach is over here on the left, is Frank Beamer of Virginia Tech Hokies. He's retired now, but he was sort of 20 some years at Virginia Tech, the head football coach. But the kind of coach I'm thinking of here is a lot like Frank Beamer, but you may not be familiar with Frank Beamer. You may be familiar with a gentleman named Ted Lasso, a fictional character named Ted Lasso. Ted Lasso is a character in an Apple Plus TV series. And he is hired to be the coach of a European football team. He's an American football coach, knows nothing about what we call soccer over on this side of the pond. But what he does know about is he knows about people, and he knows how to get people to improve and get the best out of themselves. He knows how to get them to work together towards a goal of winning together. And that's the kind of coach we're looking for. We're not looking for security experts. We're looking for these people that are used to working with developers and getting developers to change their behavior. And the group of folks I steal from the most to find these coaches are Agile Scrum Masters or Agile coaches. These are the people that sort of have the right skills and the right background to be successful at this. Even if they know nothing about security, the list of practices is documented, and it's documented by even engineers that work at that organization. They were involved in documenting it. So they can just refer to those engineers when they need sort of deep dive technical background. But the coach is there to sort of keep them on the track of ever improving. And so the way we do that is with this maturity model of sorts, from thoughts to words to actions to culture. THWAC is the acronym there. I know it's a little kind of counter to the sort of kumbaya feeling I'm going for here, but it sort of catches your attention and you won't forget it. THWAC. So basically the idea here is that for any individual practice, it goes through a series of adoption steps, thoughts to words to actions to culture. And notice how this is not red, amber, green. This is just white, meaning you haven't gotten to it yet, to darker shades of green. And so you're just greening up over time here. So I see a bunch of stuff in the chat here. Let me check real quick to make sure we're good here. So, okay, it looks like I don't need to do anything there for that. Okay.
Are you good?
Okay, great. So the way the coach works with this is the coach will sit down with an individual development team using this list of practices. And they'll start at the top of the list. Remember, it's prioritized. In fact, it's weighted. There's like points on it, so we can gamify it with the team. And we start with the most important ones at the top, at the beginning of the workshop. And we start talking to the development team about them. Do you do this? How do you do this? Can you show me the records of this? Is this automated? Is this integrated? Are you actually rapidly processing them? What's your MTTR for your median time to resolve for tool vulnerability feedback, et cetera? So it's a conversation. It's not a checkbox survey with a list of 40 things that they have to sort of give answers. And by the fifth one, they're sort of like, I'm just going to give them the answers I think they want, because this is really embarrassing. I'm just going to keep going with this. No, it's not like that at all. We're just talking about one or two or three things at first. And we're talking to them deeply about it. And we're talking about it in a way that assures that they would get value at it, that they wouldn't just check a box doing it. And when we find a gap, as soon as we find sort of a half dozen of these or less, as soon as we find a half dozen, we stop the gap analysis. We don't even look at the rest of the list. It's a partial gap analysis. And we ask the team to pick 1 to 3 practices that they want to turn one shade of green darker, using that maturity model, this maturity model, one shade of green darker in the next 90 days. And so the team will pick 1 to 3 things. And then by the end of the workshop, we ask them to make a commitment to this. And we make sure the business people are in the room for this. So those are the first people we ask. Are you willing to do everything in your power to ensure that the team achieves these goals of adopting these 1 to 3 practices in the next 90 days? We start with the business people in the room. And often they say, no, I'm not willing to do everything in my power. We've got features to get out. Well, what would you need to change about that commitment that you would be willing to commit to it? And remember, I'm documenting this and sharing this with the whole company. So, make a commitment you're willing to actually achieve, because we're going to measure the achievement of these commitments. And the business people, that's sort of the way you need to talk to the business folks. And they will come up with a smaller list maybe of things they would be willing to commit to. And that's really important, because now you have the developers on board, because the list of practices was written by developers or with developers in the room, and they're actively advocating for the list. Now, after that session, it's got the business people who are making a commitment, and the team, of course, wanted to do this stuff all along. They care about engineering excellence. And I know you might be laughing. It's like, no, our teams don't care about security at all. You think that's really not what I found. If you talk about security the way security people do it, sure, they don't want to do it that way. And so it looks like they don't care, but they actually care passionately about the products they're building. They want to be proud of what they're doing. And so they care about engineering excellence. And all you have to do is essentially couch this as an aspect of engineering excellence. And the DevOps movement is doing a great job of helping with this. So security is sort of the first character. The security lead is the first character that you meet in the Phoenix Project, which is the book that helped launch the DevOps movement. And so this is what it looked like when I did this at Comcast. We had 40 practices in the end, but you'll start with about a dozen or so practices to kick this off. So the first reaction I get from folks when I tell them to coach individual teams every 90 days is, that'll never scale. We only have 3 people in our security group. We can't get to every team every 90 days. There's no way we can have an individual meeting with every development team every 90 days. And that's just not true. I mean, that's the sort of the attitude, the feeling you have, because security has this sort of negative relationship with development. So they don't want to sort of sit down that often with development teams. But the reality is that these workshops are 90 minutes for the first one and 60 minutes for the follow-on ones every 90 days, which is like an hour and a quarter on average. So if you do 10 of these a week, it's only 12 and a half hours a week. And if there's 10 working weeks in a quarter available to you, that's 10 times 10, that's 100 teams that you can coach in a 90-day period. And so when we did this at Comcast, we had one coach that sort of was comfortable at 90 teams. And anytime we got the average of the load for the coaches up above about 70 teams, we went and hired again. So we didn't reach our capacity. But this scaled very, very nicely. We were able to scale to 600 development teams at Comcast, and we still only had a handful of people doing these coaching, and we federated it too. So we had a little bit more than a handful of federated coaches, but they had to use the same process and the same list, and they had to go through the same training that our coaches went through. So not only does it scale, but it's actually 1/4 as expensive as the traditional ways of doing AppSec. And I have data that shows it's 6 times more effective. So the ROI is 24x. There is a open source tool that will render those graphs. that I've got going. I've got a few alpha users. I'm accepting applications for beta users. So if you want to hit transformation.dev, you can sign up for a beta for that when I'm ready for doing public beta on that. Transformation.dev is the URL, and the software is called transformation.dev blueprint. So how am I doing on time here? I was sort of going slow and thinking we didn't have James.
You have about 5 minutes, Laurie.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So the next challenge is essentially working with the development teams in a technical way. And so you need to have developers that work on the security team to do this. I called them pipeline engineers at Comcast, but I think platform engineering is now sort of more of a common phrase for what those folks do. But basically, they're the ones building the self-service tools. They're making the easy button for the developers to self-service adopt these practices, especially the tool-oriented versions of the practices or the automation aspects of the practices. And another benefit out of this, and this was sort of like an unanticipated huge benefit, is that we required that as these engineers are writing code, so these tools are not just configuring something, they're actually creating new software that the development teams use to accomplish this. So their software development team, the pipeline engineering team, is a software development team. They spend about half their time writing code and about half their time working with other development teams. But while they're writing their code, they're actually dog fooding using all of the practices and tools that we would be suggesting that the destination development teams would use. And you don't know how many times this caused us to basically push back on some security executives saying, no, that's not ready for prime time. That there's no way a development team is going to like doing this. It's just it's not fit for them, or the tool doesn't work well, or whatever it is. There were lots of false starts prevented because my team took the heat of trying the thing out before we actually started trying to push it out to development teams. So optimize for learning is another lesson, and I'll skip right to this. I think this is one of James' favorite slides, and if I went too fast on it, he would kill me. And then I'll hand it over to James for his section. So the defect vulnerability incident 3-step is what's this called. And so the mentality we have when there's a vulnerability detected by a tool or found in pen testing or an incident in production is to just fix the thing that was found. And that's 1x valuable. But if you actually were to take that thing and turn it into a pattern and look for other patterns like that, not just in the current target of evaluation, but in everything you're responsible for, then that's 10x as effective if you fix those. But the real power, the 100x effective, comes when you put in place a change that will cause you never to actually create that vulnerability in the future. And this is often, sometimes it's a technical change, sometimes it's a tweak of the tool. Technical changes can be extreme, though, like shifting from C++ coding to Java coding to get rid of buffer overflow kind of vulnerabilities. So that's huge, but often that's not needed. Often it's just learning. And so if the developers sort of get this deep kind of learning that happens from rapid feedback in a DevOps way of developing, they'll never write a vulnerability like that again in the future. And that learning prevents them from having that. So we use metrics to sort of move the program along with this 3 purposes of metrics: to gain sponsorship for the program, to drive team improvement, and to also improve your program. So you get feedback on which things are working, which things are not. This is the visualization that's in transformation.dev blueprint that sort of tracks the progress of the team, the groups of teams. And this is over time. This is a moment in time kind of view across many different teams, 10 different teams, 11 different practices here in this example. Okay, so a couple of sort of takeaways here. I'd love to sort of help you launch a program like this at your own organization. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn and ask any questions there. If you want more details, I'd be glad to sort of speak with you. And with that, I'll hand it back to Andrew, who will, I think, hand it off to James.
Thank you, Larry, for those great insights. And yes, we have James McKinley has joined us. So good to see you here, James. Say hello and hand to you, Larry, if you could stop sharing so James can. Thank
Thank you very
you.
much. Yes, really excited to be here. There was nothing going to stop me from getting here. It's handy that Larry could step in on the hour. It'll be interesting for me to follow Larry. We're passionate about the same topic from very different angles. Larry has the experience of building up these programs of helping developers in companies, and I've come from a security angle and a consulting to small business angle. So two different perspectives, but we both love the subject. I'm going to see now if I can connect to my slides. We've got screen, app, share, and then I'm going to hit from the current slide. Am I right in thinking that you are able to see my deck up on
I am indeed.
Thank you very much. Right, let's just crack on. So the topics have been developing over the year. So I thought it was just best to very quickly hit on those foundations. We've heard about the Phoenix Project, which really took the message out there to the masses, but the ideas behind the current DevOps practices go back much further than that. They go some of the ideas date back to the late 1990s, but the work in books can be traced back to 2008. And so I've talked about things I've seen and when I go in to help people, and things that I don't want to keep seeing again and again. My thoughts on OWASP and serverless. But now we're moving on to look at software supply chains. And you've heard S-Bonds mentioned a few times, and some of the feelings that leaves people with when they actually come to look at how useful they'll be or how they'll tackle it. But it's worth coming back to before this executive order 14028. There wasn't really a push. There wasn't something, the kick up the arse, sorry about the language, but that we needed to really be forced to look at the topic. But that changed with Executive Order 14028. And then NIST, really important for developing standards and guides, and well known around the world. NIST on this side of the pond, I've been working with NIST documents right back to the early days of PCI, where they said, you need to pick a standard, and NIST provides standards. So your 2006, 7, 8, even on this side of the pond, as we like to say, we've been working with NIST documents, and they are very helpful, very powerful. They're not the only place to go for standardized documents, but they do a lot of work in support of the changes in US regulations. So they had a paper out, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity, that was set out some how to start on answering what was asked of executive order. And it really came about, the most famous of the supply chain hacks being the SolarWinds hack. It's been talked about the actors, what they were able to do, where they were able to get, where they were able to bounce through other organizations, how many organizations were impacted, things like that. It was talked about a lot, but the topic was not new. The idea of getting into the supply chain and changing some binaries, backdooring things, was not a new topic. And there are a number of very famous cases that can be used to, when you need to talk about the serious problem that didn't just come up once. And a couple of classics are the CC Cleaner, which is such a popular tool, but also the MEDOC in Ukraine, where collateral damage went worldwide because of the interconnectedness of global companies. So it's very difficult with a destructive worm like the meat problem to contain to a country with global companies sharing software and having to be forced to use certain types of software. So that's driven let's put something in regulation and let's make people look at the problem. And out of that paper, there's three main points: evaluating software security and evaluating the practices of the developers and suppliers. So it's two different tracks that both need to be dealt with. You have to change the way that companies develop, train developers, what they provide them with, and what you pass on, what you import from lower down the food chain, and what you pass on to your customers, and then the actual technical ability to say what is in your software. So the two different areas that both have to be dealt with to deal with this particular issue. The conversation really got a kickstart again when this paper, so there was the NIST comment on the executive order, and then they got out this paper, Securing the Software Supply Chain, Recommended Practice for Developers. And there was a lot of people saying it's very welcome and it was very good, it's very helpful. And for those of us who have been around for a while, a few gray hairs, a few wrinkles, a few scars, it's always worth taking these things with a pinch of salt. It is great that someone is researching and releasing and helping, but it won't solve the problem for everyone. And trying to follow all the advice that's given in it to the letter is not really an option. But it's a very, very good paper. You should read the paper, see the message the paper is trying to give, rather than the exact instructions you might not be able to follow. And so I say a lot of praise for the fact that this was being done and done at reasonable speed, considering how slow things can move. But it's worth a balance, a counterbalance to that. For balance, as it says in the text I popped on this slide. And now this isn't the only comment for debate on the paper. This was the first one that appeared in the groups that I get my research from, and it's an incredibly good read and an incredibly important read, because it's saying, well, thank you very much, NIST, for putting that out, that very broad, this is what the academics think. But when it smashes up to real life, to the world that the business lives in, there's lots of areas that it's going to struggle to work in. And so it was put up there, not just to fan the flames on the internet, but really to get people thinking critically about the difference between an academic paper and making it work in real life. There have been other ones since that are also good read, and if anyone's interested, when I look up some of the other links, I can share them. But this was the first one that I was reading, and then I got into a conversation with Larry, and he'd also come across it in other groups and was reading it and saw the value in putting up this might not work in the real world argument. And it's not the first time it's been done for a NIST academic paper, because another group, the CISA group, put out a paper on IoT. And a similar debate started with the people who live in the real world and have a few years of trying to make things work under their belt. Came up and said, it's great academic advice, but in real life, it's not practical enough. You're asking us to do things that will break more than they fix. So everything needs to be tuned to the environment, no matter where it's coming from. Let's go on. So I just wanted to zoom in, and there's a particular point 2 particularly resonates with the idea of moving to more automation in pipelines and adding the automation that is needed to verify what's software and label your software and pass on your SBOMs, your bill of materials. And that is the thinking machine paradox. And this, it's an interesting one. And my slide there highlights, I just need to move a little bit of my Zoom interface so that I can see it. But it goes on to say that the people who wrote the paper wrote it from a perspective of the developers might be the greatest threat. So we're going to add some more automation, but we're not going to trust the automation. We're going to get it verified by those same developers that we set out to say we don't trust. So it's that kind of, where do you start in the circle? How do you break the chain? Is my paraphrasing the thinking machine paradox. Really interesting, because I think computers are built for automation. I think that we should automate as much as possible. I think software build, push into an environment, that deliver into production. Automation will get us there. Everything will be more standardized. It'll be a safer environment. It'll be a more secure environment. We can rely on the logs. I just think that we should take the brakes off a bit, and we shouldn't be introducing, as the NIST paper seems to have done, the idea that the developers are the problem, and you better have some manual checks so that the automation doesn't run away with itself as well. So very interesting counterpoint to the work in the NIST paper. Now, coming on to my thoughts and what I think we should be doing more of, which is the automation and the working towards SBOMs, as you hear being passed around. There is already quite a lot of work out there to help you. And so here are 5 areas that I'll just touch on in case you hadn't come across them, so that you might be able to introduce them into your practices, and it will help with the automated creation or consumption of SBOMs, and not just the SBOMs, but surrounding practices and infrastructure and communities that to make it work. And a lot of this is very well described and linked back to in the CloudSecDocs site. So OWASP, we've heard OWASP mentioned, and Larry and myself agree on a lot of things, and then it'd be wrong if we agreed on everything, disagree on a few things. One thing that I have said, and my view on this has changed over the years. When I first was introduced to the OWASP top 10 for web applications, I thought it was a great idea, because someone had written down the most likely problems that have quite severe impacts in some cases, and that gave things like the PCI standard, things like people who want to grade the maturity of things, people who want to ask questions of security teams. It gave them a target to shoot at, or a level to achieve. But both the people who started that project and those of us who have seen it being used and misused over the years, you come to realize that should be a minimum, just like a NIST CSF should be seen as a minimum, or a PCI DSS should be seen as a minimum. It's not the place to get there. It's the place to say that you've got the security foundations right and things are running in a decent way. So OWASP top 10, great for introducing people to the idea, but shouldn't be seen as the gold medal at the Olympic Games, I think. OWASP has lots of very, very good projects as well. It's not just the top 10 on its cycles, and it also has gone further than the developers guide. So back in the early days of OWASP projects, the big book, the 300-pager, was the developers guide, but that was developer training with a security slant. But what about the people who have to go and check how do all the people who have to set the security minimum within an organization. So another project that came out was the application security verification standard, which is up to its major version is 4 at the moment, I think. And so I prefer to that as the starting point. Forget the OWASP Top 10, forget the OWASP Developer Guide. The ASVS is my go-to document at OWASP, but it is a big one. It's something I dip into when I get to a conversation, when someone says, "Oh, what's your guidance on authentication in web apps and things like that?" It's something to dip into, something to set your internal company standards on. It's not something that is an easy read. I also go on about ISO and the others there that I'll come on to that I all think really help us. So that was me talking about OWASP, and they continue to list vulnerable and outdated components. So if it's the only thing you can pin your problems on because it's the only thing accepted by your IT director, or the only thing it's accepted by your internal audit or your external audit because it's the only thing they've heard of because they're from outside of these sort of community chats on doing things better, then you can use wherever vulnerable and outdated components is sitting in the latest version of Top 10, as we have to fix the software supply chain problems to hit the target of AO6 as it is at the moment. So that's another use for the Top 10. If it's the only thing people have heard of, then you can use it to get your software security program in their mind about achieving something that they understand. Then ISO, there's an ISO standard for just about everything, but the classics are, there is an ISO standard that matches ITIL service desk. There's an ISO standard for quality, 9001. There's a whole family of ISO standards around security, 2001, 27001, 27002, 27005 are the classics, but there are lots of others in the same family, like a forensic lab or an incident response thing. And there are 2 that align to when you first start getting involved with software labeling and software bill of materials. Those are, and these ones are public. These aren't ones where you have to pay $150 for them. These ones, and those links are take you to the public docs. They're PDFs in their standard format. And the second one is on SBOMs, software bill of materials. So that, if you wanted to read what the consensus of the ISO, you should go there and have a look at these. So it gets a mention on the front page of the SPDX project. So this is one of those projects like Salsa and like Sigstore that it's the developer community coming together to look at how we're going to how we're going to fix this. And so the software packaging data exchange definitely should be part of what you're considering when you're looking at how you can automate the consumption, the building your own, and the passing on of software labeling. SLSA, that you've heard me calling SALSA. So the supply chain levels of software artifacts. This is a very interesting project. You can find it through CloudSec docs, you can find it through talking about it or .dev domains. And let's see if I go on to, yes. So they've got, it's a way of grading how well you're practicing the basic security in producing software. And so they give you, it's like a maturity level, but it's a maturity level for common sense things that you can do that are improving your software security. So again, if you have some influence over putting the sec in DevSecOps, I would say do have a look at this and see if you can adopt it. Just like you might be saying to your senior management, well, we're going to hit removing vulnerable libraries that is mentioned in OWASP top 10, you might be able to say, if they want you to go further and come to them with something about true DevSecOps, you can say, well, we're going to start aligning all our work to SALSA and scoring ourselves against SALSA. So it's a way, it's like a gamified way of increasing how well you're doing the practical common sense basics, and this site will talk you through all of that. Now, one that I haven't previously used in these sort of conversations, but I think it's really, really important that it comes in now. If you're going to start automating SBOM generation, then there needs to be tooling and a community that understands they've got the right tooling and how they're going to use that tooling. And Sigstore is one of the ones that you can adopt to be right in the middle of it. So it'll also work with containers. So if you want to automatically generate SBOMs for what has gone into a container and then attach it, then you will need Sigstore. So altogether, the SPDX, the SALSA, the Sigstore, and some of the other work at CloudSec Docs can really put you on a good path, which will work with other people and what other people are doing. So it's not come up with your own way of doing it. It's not come up with the academic NIST way of doing it. It's do what the community knows is going to work, is what I would say. And this is a little dip into CloudSec Docs that will also go into all the other things we've covered. Really, really helpful site. So that's some of the things that you can use specifically around SBOM and specifically around trying to automate the checking what's coming in and then generating your own. That's where especially the Sigstore comes in. When it comes to actually building a software vulnerability management program in-house, this is something I've been working on with a couple of companies I consult with. You can do it, again, going back to an OWASP project. There's one there called Defect Dojo. There are other ways to do it. There are commercial ways to do it. There are spreadsheets, write your own web app, whatever. But what you're looking for is the old bug tracker idea, but making it work in a global organization with regional teams, big teams, hundreds of projects. It's a bug tracker that focuses on application security. So it can be dependency checks, it can be vulnerability scans of a finished product or a host server, it can be results from a pen test, it can be results from a source code review, it can be absolutely any of the security assurance practices. You can get the results into this global bug tracker to do deduplications and groupings, which will lead you on to the 3-step that Larry said he had to spend some time on, because it's one of those points where we both really see the value in once you've understood the elimination of a whole class of bugs is where I like to get to as my step 3. You need the data, and you need the data that it's just the right amount of data. So you need to be somewhere where you can put everything in, and then you can dedupe it and group it, and say you're going to ignore this, and say you're going to fix this, and say this is fixed. And you need a tool that is simple but not too simple. And I would recommend looking at the bug tracker approach, and looking at whether you've invested in a commercial thing that can handle this, whether you're going to experiment with Defect Dojo that can handle this. But that is just one part. It's going back to those 2 points, 2 different tracks to sort out software security supply chain. One is the company approach and the developer approach, and one is the technical approach. And SBOMs and software labeling, they're not exactly the same thing as well. The world at the moment is focusing on SBOM, which is just one tiny element of all this other stuff. So a security program, it has to think about the oversight of the developers, the training, the access to repos, the access to tools, the access to local admin accounts to update tooling. You've got your software vulnerability tracking and the KPIs that come from that. You know, are we catching them earlier? Are we getting less? Are less making it into production? Choosing some KPIs that demonstrate by getting on board with a software vulnerability management program that focuses on software supply chain, you are making things much safer. Because you heard a comment in Larry's talk, and it's something that Andrew likes to talk about as well. Developers don't want to ship shoddy code. They want to ship high quality, high performance, secure code. They don't want to be the reason that a whole company got owned by a web hack. They want to ship, high quality and secure. We just need to help them do it earlier on, faster, more simpler. And so I'm saying that some of the things we talked about today are just one element of a wider software, SVM, software vulnerability management program. That's quite a bit of talking from me. And like it says, time is very precious. I was trying to bring us back up to finish on the hour. This is something I could talk about all day, so it's actually quite hard for me to keep it to that 25-30 minutes, but I am happy to hand over to whatever the next session is, and I'm also happy to take heckling from Larry.
Or me.
Yeah,
I guess thank you, James. Sorry we had so many problems getting you in, but thank you very much for that session. We've got the panel session at the end, so maybe we'll noodle on a few of those things, because I've got a couple of questions, a couple of thoughts myself, and I'm sure Larry has as well as talking about our poll sessions. Let's skip to the bit of a user stories or customer journey stories that I was going to present, and we'll rattle through that. And then see where we are. We should have at least half an hour left. So just sharing my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that now. Excuse me, yell if not. So yes, I wanted to talk a couple of customer stories and about shifting smart. And foundation of this is that traditional AppSec slows development. We're talking DevSecOps, we're talking future. How do we speed up? How do we make things more owned by development teams here? And when you think about traditional AppSec, it's often an impediment. It's often heavy in terms of false positives, because a lot of the time things are guessing, or it's non-contextual when it does really understand there is a problem. And frequently as well, it's a gatekeeper type function. And requires experts to understand, to absorb, triage results, etc., and then deliver back to the developers. And as a gatekeeper function, that generally also becomes an ugly baby syndrome problem. So a developer spends a nice bit of time writing a new piece of functionality, they push it into the rest of the team, it goes all the way through, 3 weeks later or whatever, back comes a pen test or some other result that says there's a problem in that code. And as James alluded to, and I firmly believe, developers love to deliver quality, fantastic code that does an excellent job, and they're really creative in what they want to do. And that's just depressing when you get that type of thing coming back. And the other factor here is that, we've got impossible economics. We're trying to write code 10 times faster. We've still got legacy tools in place. And the software security crisis is growing, so much so that even where teams have got these policies in place, these gatekeeper functions or whatever it might be, they're quite often bypassed, actually. So we've got to get this feature out. We haven't got time to complete the security or sort the features, the pen test results out and get things sorted. So we'll have an exception. And then next month you get another exception and so on. And then pen tests trying to catch up, or DAST or whatever it might be. And the problem with part of that tooling is that a lot of this is looking from the outside in. A SaaS solution is looking at the code, trying to understand based on what it sees, what the product's doing. DAST is again looking from the outside in, trying to break things, pen test the same. WAFs are also sitting outside of the application and trying to just basically intercept and prevent attacks with no knowledge about what the application does. And one of the things I've heard recently from a CISO of an organization is don't talk to me about DAST. It's the biggest fraud of the last 20 years. And then, yeah, SaaS for me just breaks everything we're trying to do. So we're actually hearing this from the communities as well. And one of the things we really think about is that finding isn't fixing. Improvements in your security posture are only achieved through resolution of vulnerabilities and problems. So you've got to get to the heart of the only people that can really fix these problems, which is the developers. That's where it needs to happen, and that's where we need to interact with them much, much better. So to talk about one customer story, I've got two here to talk about it. Slightly different angles, actually. The first one here is really around definitely is from BMW, large organization. We've all heard of them. And they were facing some problems with limited rising costs and limited security improvements. Everything had to be pen tested, which was their policy. It's expensive, difficulty interpreting response late in the game. And they were really seeking pipeline native AppSec tooling that could work much better with the development teams. So rather than a month after a piece of work's being done, suddenly saying there's a problem, well, we know there's a problem in your product, in this part of the product, but we really don't know as a pen test where you need to go to fix it. How can they overcome that? And they started looking for instrumentation-based approach to this. So rather than the legacy outside in, which is often disruptive, can't keep up even with an army of experts, it's after the fact, etc. That if you take an inside out model where the security elements can actually see what's going on through direct observation of the product operating, the application operating, then they can get a much more effective and contextual solution to those application security challenges. And how this IaaS works, and there are a few things out there. We obviously have one, and we feel it's much better than SAST or DAST in a number of areas, which I'll touch on in a moment. The normal testing of an application with IaaS means that as data flows through the application, it's observed, and the security vulnerability assessment can happen based upon the actual data flows through the application, not the ones that SAST tries to derive from what it can see in the code, but the actual data flows through that application. So by looking at that data, seeing how it moves through an application, you can get instant feedback on whether or not a vulnerability exists. And it's contextual because the stack trace is available. You can see exactly how that data went through the application. And it can also it's highly accurate because of that exact observability of what's going on. So developers can leverage those results immediately, and you can put that into the pull request. So a developer writes a new piece of code, and this is where shifting left really comes into its own. So they're proud of that code. They want to push it up into the next level of and get peer reviews and acknowledgement from their peers that they've delivered something that's sweet. Now, if you also, as part of that pull request, as well as doing standard testing, etc., you actually leverage a vulnerability tool that's observing what's going on at that time, you can get very early indication, even before the peers are looking at the code, as to what problem is. You could take it to extremes as well and put it right inside the as the as the developer's writing, but that's a little bit interrupting the developers as they're flowing. So that point where you go, okay, I've just spent 2-3 hours, this new feature, functionality, pull request to merge to the development branch from my feature. Okay, got a problem. Right, I'll fix that, and now I'll do it. And you've hit a sweet spot for developers owning security as something they can work with. And that accuracy that BMW achieved and those immediate actionable results led to significant reduction in the number of pen tests that they undertake. So there's time back from not supporting those pen tests for developers. Problems found early cost a lot less to fix. And that even, if you then scale that again by what Larry was talking about earlier, fixing a problem is great. Fixing others like it is great, but taking another stage further where you fix and get contextual learning applied to stop the problem ever happening again. And this type of process can really help with that contextual learning, attaching out to things like Secure Code Warrior. So you've got an SQL injection, here's how to fix it. This is why it exists as well. This is what you can do to overcome and learn in that direction. But let's just think a little bit what we were looking at BMW in terms of this scenario of shifting smart, putting in application security testing at the right point in the development life cycle that can engage directly with the developers. Cost of a pen test, average cost $5,000, 8 hours of disruption, helping the pen testers to get up to speed with all of the application and how they have a test environment set up, etc. And findings from a pen test take longer than if you find them early. It's a natural fact because you've got a context switch. You've got to maybe find the developer, if you can, who did the original piece of work. They've got a context switch out of what they're doing. They've got to examine what the pen test is saying, understand how that translates into the code and how that then needs to be fixed to prevent that vulnerability. And of course, you've got retest elements as well. So if you if we looked at this, so fewer pen tests, so down from 12 roughly a year to just the one. So still doing a pen test, just to be sure. Security has to be layered. No one tool is 100% perfect. No one solution is 100% perfect. So layers are good. If you reduce the number of pen tests, you've got less disruption. The cost per finding can come down to actually well below 30 minutes, but let's say 30 minutes for this data we started looking at. And late stage rework becomes 0. And of course, if you find and fix early before you get to a pen test, then you don't have any retests either. So we were thinking when we were talking about this about 100 teams, taking that as a snapshot example. Now doing one release a month, and it may be more, but sort of generalize some of the figures for ease of use. And now doing one pen test a year instead of 12. Talking about 3 findings per pen test, not uncommon. And if we then take all of those figures, immediate saving is that due to the number of reduced pen tests, you're down from $6 million to $500,000. That's just a pure cost outlay that the business can recover back. But I feel that the more interesting finding is the time that you get back. So just the disruption element of setting up for those and supporting those pen tests, you are nearly 9,000 hours back for those teams. And then if you think about catching early and taking a lot less time to remediate issues and even driving to that contextual learning as well, then that's 13,000 hours back. If you put all that together, that's 3,000 days a year that those 100 teams are getting back. And if you think about that as one team, that's one team getting a developer and a half per year for extra features and functionality. And by putting all of this in the hands of the developers, security can become a quality issue. As I said earlier, developers love to ship quality code. And if you can give them the tools and you can give them the ability to own and take responsibility for that, they will gladly take that on board and make security a quality issue. The other one I want to talk about isn't so much developer-centric, but it does talk to the supply chain, the SBOM and component challenge. And that is, how do you prevent zero-day exploitations? With the best will in the world, a developer or a set of developers creating an application using components, they still say that 85%, 90% of applications written today use open source or libraries, even if they're commercial. So your own code is relatively small. In fact, just harking back to the observability element, if you have observability built into the application at runtime, then you can actually find vulnerabilities that are a result of third-party code, not just your own code as well. That aside, how do you deal with zero-day? Log4j, we mentioned a couple of times recently in this call. How do you deal with that problem suddenly appearing, where you find that a library that's ubiquitous, used everywhere pretty much, is suddenly known to be vulnerable, but has in fact been vulnerable since 2013, although only discovered and published last year. So we worked with a financial services platform provider. I can't give any details about them, but they needed zero-day exploit prevention. Defense on the periphery is limited. So a WAF lacks application content. Not to say you want to get rid of them, because they do good things, but generally they're signature-based, there'll always be a lag. And the other thing is, sometimes they can be bypassed as well. It was demonstrated for the Log4j, even a WAF with signatures, etc., was bypassable. So again, the company here was seeking application native protection. So having context, having real-time protection, and they wanted something that worked on expected behaviors, not on known issues, i.e. not in that signature based. So as I said, outside in, WAFs, firewalls, DAS, etc. Again, they're always lagging the real world. After the fact, inaccurate, etc. Again, if you put an observability component directly into the application at runtime, you can examine the code as data passes through it. You can examine the data, as it passes through the code. God, that's the wrong way around. So normal and rogue traffic, for want of a better term, come into the application, they pass through the application, and a tool that's working inside an application and looking at behaviors rather than signatures can actually understand whether or not attack is actually real and actually protect from unknown attacks. So 0 days that are not even known yet. So in the case of Log4j, this type of application, this type of security protection allowed the data to be examined as it flowed through the application, and then discover that why would an application allow an RCE to then call out to somewhere else to pull down something else? That's just not the type of behavior an application would do. So you can just block it, even though you don't know that it's an actual attack on a vulnerable library. So what this customer got was accurate and context sensitive results, again, because the testing is, the observing, etc., is happening within the application. And it's a behavior-based analysis. And the security postures significantly improved for those 0 day scenarios, because prevention is much better than the cure. I'm not going to read all this out, but we got a couple of pieces of feedback on all of this when Log4j happened. So single agent allowing us to understand and protect against these vulnerabilities without having to patch or update. And actually this solution tends to work as well with, really well with legacy applications where no one really maintains the code anymore. No one's got an interest in fixing and finding and fixing vulnerabilities in that legacy code, or maybe even hasn't got the capability in the organization as well. So this ability to protect at the runtime is very important. And one of the other things we heard back on Log4Shell, that teams that had Protect in place were able to go home and teams that just had an IaaS tool in place knew whether or not an application was vulnerable to Log4j because they knew whether or not the application actually used that library at runtime as well. And of course, as I said earlier, vulnerability has existed since 2013. So that's it from me. I rattled through that, but please feel free to do ask questions. I wanted to leave us plenty of time for the poll session at the end. And hopefully, Larry, I can see Larry, and there's James as well, both back with us. So we have a couple of polls to come up, but I did want to just talk to James about something, actually. You mentioned the Application Security Verification Standard, ASVS.
Yeah.
I like a lot of what it says, but it does, well, I would say heavily, it does 100% call out SAST and DAST as that solution that you should use to overcome all of these problems. Do you feel that's still correct? Obviously I don't, but thought I'd get your take.
With anything that is, committee driven, volunteer driven contributions from the industry, it takes a long time to put a significant change in. If you think about the password guidance, about 2015, 2016, people started saying, we've got to get away from rapid rotation and complexity rules. Every time someone brute forces passwords, they get hit for summer 2022 and password 1999, and last month it was password 1998, or it was, and next month it's going to be autumn 2022. So the guidance came out in about, and people were going on the conference circuit and saying, I've got empirical evidence that this is wrong, let's do something about it by 2016. 6 years later, we're only just getting things like the NCSC and probably the NIST reboot of their authentication paper, saying this isn't the answer. You can do something different now. And then it takes another a bit of time for the external audits, like your Accentures, your EYs, to get on board with the changes that the standards people have taken on board, which has come from the community, which has come from people having to research it because they've got a feeling that this is wrong. It's the same with any paper that changes every few years and has a lot of contributors. So I like solving security problems in a practical way, and it can be in a way that no one else has thought of or done before. So I don't think that label of best practice or de facto way of doing it works in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is getting to the bottom of, is this code doing what you planned it to do? Did you plan it to do the right thing, and did it do it? Not, can someone hijack this code to make it do something that they want? That's the red versus blue of code executing in a CPU. Did you design it right? Yes. Did it do what you designed? Yes. If either of those fail, then you could be hijacked and exploited. So there are bound to be better ways. And there's also never a one-size-fits-all. That's something that came up a few times in my talk, and every conversation I have about policy, procedure, designing an SDLC, designing security gates. People don't like security gates, but they serve a purpose. There's no one-size-fits-all. So I think it's a fantastic reference book on the end of the desk, and you can extract text from it for your own purposes, like adding into a policy or a procedure. This is the community's de facto text on AAA or something. But I do think there are better ways of solving some of the problems. I think that about just about every cybersecurity problem I see. I think there's another way to do this that might be a better cost, more practical, give you a quicker result. Also, there's always more than one way to solve the problem, and I'm always happy to go with an alternative. Anyway, that's how I would answer that. Andrew, what do you think of that?
That's fine. No, that's fine. Larry, any thoughts? You're still
Took
muted.
me a second to come off mute there. Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit during my section, that you have to come up with your own list. I mean, you can borrow from things like ASVS, and the ASVS guidance is something like 20, 30 pages, I think, not in the 400 pages. And it is sort of more of a higher level checklist. But you're right, it just talks about SAST and DAST. It doesn't talk about IAST or RAST. And we are an IAST and RAST vendor, so that's not why we're advocating for it, although, that is somewhat self-serving. We built IAST and RAST because of the shortcomings of SAST and DAST. And so we believe that those are not ideal, especially for developer-centric approaches to application security. And so I think the message that I would sort of send there, Andrew, in support of your vibe is that, use those things as sort of like starting points and understand them maybe to a certain degree. Don't go crazy on researching and trying to cross-reference the 5 different standards you could pull from. Just sort of get your own sort of basic understanding of it, and then put together a list paired with the development team who has used these tools, the developers that have used these tools. That sort of approach is how I like to recommend people go about it.
Yes, so going back to some things you were saying earlier, it's about finding the appropriate things that can improve matters for your team at this time. There is a perfection, but we will probably never get there anyway, and that side of things. James, you mentioned policy there. I'm an advocate of policy, but cautiously, because enforcement is frequently ineffective.
You can get policy and the word used in lots of different places. Some people call a firewall rule set policy. That's, some people think the GRC paperwork or that lays out the business rules at a quite a high level, because you're going to have procedures underneath, is your policy. And there are other places it comes up that, it comes up in tools. I'm going to apply this policy inside something. I don't know. Trivy might use policies. And I do think that for companies where the developers and the security, they're all one team. Then policy as code, and the combination of the audit logs of the pipeline and policy as code, and vulnerability checking gates of infrastructure as code. And there's a few things, but I've just said Trivy there. Trivy might help with that. So I think you've got to be careful what you're using policy for. But in this environment, I think we can get to security policy as code. And people have written about it. I'm sure AWS will have written about it. Microsoft will have written about it. I'm sure NCC Group will have written about it. You can get there from that element of policy. But my background in information security manager, CISO type thing, is the paperwork that sets out the roles and responsibilities and the training requirements and how we're going to hit the controls of 27002 and things like that. So you can use policy to have lots of different conversations.
So Larry, I know we've talked about this quite a bit, and you've got some stories from your shop floor.
Yeah. So, I agree with James that the word policy is got many definitions, and but the one that sort of I think when James mentioned it was referring to, and when I mention it, I'm referring to, is the definition James just gave. It is essentially a pretty high level list of roles and responsibilities and expectations. But even that can be pretty long. Even that can be hundreds of pages at a company like Comcast. And I like to sort of, when I define policy, I like to break it down into 2 sort of big buckets. The first breakdown is essentially this high level roles, responsibilities. I like to say practices. I think for a reason, one of the big reasons, in fact, the biggest reason I use the word practices is that it's not that commonly used, and so it doesn't have overloaded. Some people call them controls. Some people, they're just SDLC. They're just the SDLC. They're just the process. Those are all acceptable terms to me, but I like to use the word practices. A list of practices that each person of a particular role, and the development team is the one I specialize in, would do. So for instance, get to high severity clean for all SCA findings, and a different practice might be to get to critical clean, and that would come first. So I like the practices to be very, very, very achievable. And notice how I didn't say run an SCA tool, because running the tool provides you no value. You got to get to resolving the critical findings, or resolving the high findings, or resolving the medium findings. Those are sort of the steps in my policy, sort of what level of practice you're at. The other sort of big bucket I like to have is technical guidance. And this is, I like to sort of not focus on that when I talk to developments. And I like to keep that out of big high level policy as much as possible. Just saying that you should have a threat model done by the organization's threat modeling security architect specialists, and using a checklist that they evolve and they maintain to ensure that you have protection of data at rest and in transit, et cetera. And that's the policies, that statement that you have a threat modeling activity, a practice that's actually executed a lot. But the details of what those security architects are looking for during that threat modeling is another big bucket that I like to keep out of the conversation at the highest level, and defer that to the security architects. But a lot of times these two things get mixed into one big document, and that gets very messy.
Yeah, and a 400-page document, no one reads it. You get 10 pages in, you start to think, I'm dead, I'm not going any further as well, potentially. Right. As a reference point, as James was saying, for me, it's really good to be able to pick out bits that, from time to time you need to refer back to, or help educate, or something like that. But contextual learning is the key, one of the keys, I think. Okay. Anything else from the two of you? If not, or we'll move a bit more into general forum.
Yeah, let's move on to the forum.
I was going to say, okay. Go general forum.
Yeah. Okay. So anyone, any of the attendees, any questions, please do feel to put them in Q&A. Let's pop up one of our polls. Yeah, let's do this one first of all. So here we go. Single choice question. If you could improve any one of the following, which would it be? Your ability to more comprehensively detect vulnerabilities, or the ability to rapidly resolve vulnerabilities once detected? Please have a little think and put in your thoughts. Leave a few moments for a few more people to comment and join in, or not comment, to make their vote. Okay, we've got a few results here, so let's see what we've got so far. Let me share. Okay, interesting. As a significant weighting towards the detection rather than the resolution.
Yeah, I've done this, Andrew, if I might jump in here. I've done this poll, I don't know, maybe a dozen times or more at this point. And this is literally the first time that it's come out this way. So I find this interesting. The last time I did it was live with a raise your hands kind of situation. And it was essentially one person in the room advocating for more comprehensively detecting vulnerabilities, and the rest sort of, recognize that the true bottleneck is that getting them resolved. And so, from a theoretical perspective, when I talk about this, I talk about the concepts of flow. And the concepts of flow define inventory as waste, and a big pile of vulnerabilities that aren't getting rapid resolved is inventory, which is thus waste. And so that basically reduces your ability to flow. And so you're not gonna get to a developer-centric DevOps way of doing things by collecting these big piles of vulnerabilities up front. And so and the reality is that that's actually a negative value to you, because you have a liability once you've detected something. And so I really argue strongly for making the focus be on the resolution, not be on the detecting, for most organizations. Now, some organizations are really good, but it's 10% or less in rapidly resolving things. And most of them, the big bottleneck by a long shot is in the resolution. And the way I do that is I tell them to basically declare bankruptcy and throw out all the vulnerabilities, delete them from the database, don't store them, empty your vulnerability management database. And this immediately sort of raises their hackles, but at least gets their attention. And then turn the tools back on and rerun them, but only store the most critical ones in the database, and come up with a plan that gets you to 0 for those most critical ones within the next 1 or 2 sprints for an individual development team, and maybe 90 days for the whole organization, and as a goal. And what this does is that it really focuses people on something that they can achieve. And then you put in place a blocker in the pipeline that says we'll never ship with another critical vulnerability again, or another vulnerability of this class again, or you can slice the list down any way you want, and then you slowly turn up the notch of the policy dial to the next level set. And this makes the focus be on rapid resolution. And basically you're at 1 day, less than 1 day median time to resolve of all vulnerabilities using this approach that you saw. And this actually is much more effective at reducing your overall risk. 1/6 the number of vulnerabilities in production is what my research says when you take this approach.
Throwing 50 vulnerabilities at a development team, you're just going to get pushback from the business side of things saying, we just haven't got time to deal with all of that. Whereas if you can take a more iterative approach on the important things, I feel that's much more appropriate. And it speaks as well to me of the days when, well, it still actually happens now, people talk about automated testing and it being too difficult because it's going to take months, if not years, to write all the automated tests for our application because we haven't got any. But one test is better than none. And similarly, highest priority.
Well, the funny thing is that with automated functional testing, if you're doing like test coverage measures, a single automated functional test that has the user log in, has the accomplishes the authentication step, typically gets you up to about 25% or better test coverage. And so that's a long way with just writing one test. And then you get into the habit of writing tests because you put a blocker in for that one, and then you keep incrementing the thing.
And ideally, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was saying, ideally, for me, you write a test to prove that your new feature doesn't exist, and then your test is successful when you finish that feature, sort of thing.
Very few people do it that way, including myself. I don't do it that way.
Was that the original TDD?
Yeah, but my test coverage is up in the high 80s most of the time.
I haven't done any of that since about 2003.
No, I know. It's one of, and we could talk about BDD as well, couldn't we? But let's not go there.
I actually liked, there was a company that took the BDD idea and put it into their web application vulnerability scanner. So you wrote a test that said, I don't want this server to answer on any port except 80 and 443. And then had to pass that test for the very first infrastructure thing. If you'd left anything else open, if 22 was open, it was like, well, 22 is not supposed to be open on the front door. So you failed. And it was written in a natural language. You would write, when I connect to the server and check all its ports, it must only answer on 80 and 443. That's all fair.
And a lot of vulnerabilities, especially in access control logic, a lot of vulnerabilities aren't detectable via automated tools. Although the one you mentioned is detectable.
It's a very basic first step, that one.
Yeah, very basic first step. So you have to write your custom tests for access control logic. If you don't, then you run the risk of letting people have access to things they shouldn't have access to.
I like the way you described, convincing people to throw away all the results that they were currently tracking and say the new rule is you've got 30 days to get rid of the criticals when we press go on the scanner. I was going to bring a couple of stories about that is why I like faster resolution rather than knowing more of the problem, because a lot of this sort of reminds me of where vulnerability scanning, that traditional network vulnerability scanning, was 10, maybe 15 years ago, where a company who had only just found out about it or only just been told to do it dropped a scanner in, gave it domain admin rights and said scan everything everywhere, and then had 10,000 faults to fix. It's not the way to do it. You should, proof of concept idea, you should do little samples and you should set the bar very high. But and I saw an example where we chose to use that, fix this, because I know you're going to struggle. I won't tell you about loads of problems. I'll just tell you about some you might fix. And it was a penetration test of a web app. And we came back with, there's a few cookies, a few headers, and a lot of cross-site scripting. And cross-site scripting used to be a medium finding, but now it can be quite a dangerous finding. We went back and rescanned. It took them 6 months to deal with those few things because it wasn't their speciality. They're CMS developers. They'll give you a new button in WordPress. They'll give you a new form that pumps something into your sales team from Drupal. They didn't know about eliminating XSSs that they had introduced. And so it took them months and months to fix that. And then we went back and did the retest and said, well, I'm glad you learned how to do that, because we found another 50 of them in this other bit, and we found a SQL injection. Now you've got into we have to research this and we have to fix this. Go and get on with these. So we had to give them months and months and months to get their head round. They had broken this. They had to learn how to fix this. And this was through a relationship, a supplier to a supplier. So it wasn't sit down with the team next to you and help them. It was, it had been booked for a pen test as a security company. Now, but I've got an internal story as well. And that is one where you drop in a new scanner, you tell it can scan anything, but you give people an amnesty. You say, we're moving to security gates where you're not allowed to pass unless you fixed everything. But we're not going to turn anything on in blocking mode for the next 90 days. And every 7 days or every 4 days, you'd get the reports out. You'd have a look at the numbers. After 70 days, no one had done anything, because they were all going to look at putting fixes in on day 89, because they didn't think we would put the blocks in on day 91. So giving people a 90-day amnesty to learn how to fix some things just kick the can a bit further down the road.
Yeah, so SLA is considered harmful. The only SLA that counts is less than a day, in my opinion. Basically, you got to get them to commit to getting to less than a day for a very, very, very small, low bar policy dial, but the most critical stuff policy dial. And then you slowly turn you don't actually turn it up on them. You let them turn it up on themselves. And so every program I set up has to sort of have this adaptability that allows any team to start where they are and to progress at whatever pace they're going to progress at. Now you track that pace and you gamify that pace, but the idea is that you can't do it blanket across an organization very easily. And especially large organizations, you have to work with individual teams one at a time and get them to turn up the dial. And then the peer pressure from them compared to the team next to them, the sister team, is often enough to convince the sister team to get on the stick. So it's installing the blocker is the key. Get to clean and then immediately install the blocker. And then they know they have this blocker that they install themselves in their pipeline. that won't allow this very low policy dial, admittedly, at first. And then that policy dial gets slowly turned up, so the blocking essentially moves with it. In fact, I put two blockers in place. One is not a blocker, one is just an informer, and the other is a blocker. So the informer is always on the next policy dial increment, and the blocker is on the last committed clean policy dial increment.
It's like 1% better every day, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Philosophy, rather than trying
I've
to fix.
written that down on my notes, actually. I thought about bringing that in for the small iterations of find a fix, find fix, finish, find fix, finish, find fix, finish. You
Yeah. What is finish? Finish is prevent it happening again. Yeah.
Right. Preventing.
Yeah.
So there's another quote from Gene Kim that's appropriate here. Improving work, daily work, is more important than doing daily work.
Daily work, yes.
So
Get that through the business mind, where, you know, features, functions. Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts from the floor? Any thoughts from attendees, delegates on any of that? Refutation, even? Raise your hand. All quiet. Okay. Well, let's go on to the next poll question. Just let me find that. Here we go. Right. If you could choose any one of the following, who should make sense of the S-bombs? This talks a little bit to what Larry was saying earlier and a lot to what James was noodling on, but who should make sense and essentially own the S-bomb? The producer or the consumer?
Well, I wouldn't say essentially own it, because I don't know, the producer is always going to have to create it, but the recipient could make sense of it, or the sender could make sense of it.
Yeah, I meant own, I guess, in the way who's responsible for dealing what challenges it raises.
Exactly. That's what
who owns the problem.
Who owns the problem reported by? Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Both sort of share the ownership of the problem to a certain degree, but the people on the receiving end, the only stick they have sometimes is beating up the vendor. So, you know, the only lever they have.
Let's bring these results up. We're getting a lot of results, but we have got a lot of input, but we have got some results here. So yes, producer, Larry.
Yeah. So this is the way this poll usually comes out. I've only done this a handful of times at this point, though. So I sort of like this. I think the vision around SBOM sharing is that the consumers, the recipients of the SBOM, are going to try to protect themselves with that information. And I really don't think that's feasible. Everything I've seen that proposes that requires such boil the ocean changes that it's just never going to happen. Especially in the government space where it's starting. You know, it's actually more feasible to do it in sort of like a medical devices or financial services or military controls kind of environment. Not all software that the military uses, though. But anyway, the idea here is that the producer generates the SBOM and deals with all the findings from it and all of the changes in the environment that sort of reinterpret the findings from a particular version of an SBOM, and because they're the only ones that know all the information to figure it out.
And if they're shipping you an application or delivering you an application, they're the only people who can really fix it as well. I mean, technically you can do runtime patching and things like that, but that's quite interesting.
Well, there's sometimes a workaround. So like in the Log4Shell situation, there was a workaround, and so that then you can sort of the recipient can do something sometimes. But you're right, most of the time the only lever they have is to basically beg the vendor to fix it faster.
James, thoughts? My
thought is we need to one thought on this topic is SBOM is not the answer. If you think SBOM's the answer, you're asking the wrong question. But that doesn't really fit with the topic of today, does it? But my thought is the consumer, we should make it easy for the consumer to understand what they're getting. I like labels on food packets. labels on food packets, you got on the front in the UK, you've got your salt, your sugar, your fat, and whether you pay any attention to it or whether it actually helps you, it doesn't matter. The people who produced it got the right labeling in front of you, and then you flip it over and you've got the ingredients in size of importance, whether percentage by volume or it might be, I don't know. So it's up for the consumer to understand how the labeling works. I've just explained that in the UK food packaging there might be 2 labels, and then what to do with it. If you're allergic to nuts, look for the label that says may contain nuts. So I think the same will eventually have to happen, but we have to make it as A, simple, and B, easy. And those 2 are slightly different things. That's where I'm at on this at the moment, but we're in very early stages. I think just the fact that we're talking about it today, that the community's been talking about it for years, that the NIST are pushing out things to get people who didn't want to talk about it talking about it now. I think it's good we're all talking about it, but we've a way to go. But that's my thoughts on this particular question.
Okay, Larry?
Yeah, just a quick sort of rebuttal there. I like the food labeling analogy because one of the effects of food labeling requirements is that vendors stopped putting stuff in their products that were maybe convenient for their manufacturing, but not necessarily healthy for the recipients, because they didn't want to get dinged for that in the public. And so I think the effect of labels was on the producer. Now, in the case, all models are wrong, some models are useful, and an analogy is just a model. So using the food labeling analogy there, I think is good, but I think it falls down at the point where you've described, James. I think that it's easy for people to know that too much fat and too much salt are bad for them, or if they have an allergy to nuts or some other ingredient, that it's easy for people to know that. But the complexity of the environment with software is so much more complex. You don't know even if you have a particular version of a particular dependency, the fact that it's not actually called by the application means that it's not vulnerable. And there's no way for a consumer to actually figure that out. And the changing landscape is so rapid. I mean, we know in general that medical research is evolving and we learn new things every day. Like eggs used to be bad for cholesterol, and now we're deciding that they actually don't correlate with health outcomes. So maybe that kind of cholesterol maybe isn't bad. So we do make mistakes and we do correct, but those are over the course of decades. And in the case of software, those things change on a dime, like within minutes, And so you can't keep up with the people's knowledge that way. I don't think we'll ever get there.
You could have a traffic light notification system. It'd be quite complex. And maybe, your food labeling can say, there are no reachable vulnerabilities, or we only have a CVE2 that's reachable or something, and then you can make a choice. But would you choose not to use a piece of software because of that?
Sorry to interrupt, but I think we're debating something that doesn't need debating. Because if you can't get to the code, it's not going to be exploited. If it's not going to be exploited, it's not even a risk, never mind a threat. So
yes,
if you can't get to the exploit code, it doesn't matter what the label says. The attacker's not coming in through that bit.
But
right.
You will cause the recipient to go through a lot of work to try to figure that out, and they just aren't in a place to figure it out.
Unless the label
I take you back to my comment. If you think S-bomb's the answer, you're asking the wrong question.
Yeah. Okay, so we're aligned there perfectly. Okay.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I guess I was alluding to, if it's not reachable, you don't have to put it in your label. But then you need to prove it's not reachable, I guess, at some point.
But that is I think I like that. I like that. We can possibly improve the SBOM standards to the point where they're not an SBOM. So SBOM stands literally for Software Bill of Materials. What are the ingredients is all, not the analysis of the ingredients. It's not that part of it. And so what you just described, Andrew, is essentially higher level analysis. That I think we should share up and out. But I think the production of that higher level analysis from lower level data needs to happen at the producer end, as close to the producer as possible.
Yeah, because they're the only ones that can really know.
Exactly.
Start. Yeah. Unless you give me the SBOM and all of your source code, and then I'll work it out for myself as a consumer, and that isn't going to happen.
And nobody's going to give you their source code, so you're basically never have the information on the recipient side.
Yeah. Okay. Let me get rid of that. So let's move on to the final poll, if I can find it. Oh yes, love this one. Is a lack of trust between security and development a significant challenge to moving forward in your organization? Everyone can have a punt at that one, please. Yeah, and we'll see what comes out.
I thought the last one was said don't care. I had to lean in to check it. Didn't say that.
Okay. And if you're having problems voting, don't worry. No challenges there. We're just interested in everyone's input. Give it another 5 seconds or so. He says slowly.
It's interesting. We got the most responses from this one, or getting.
Yeah.
We got 6, I think, from the other 2, and now we're up to 9 for this one.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they felt uncomfortable answering the other one, and they feel more comfortable.
Maybe, or didn't have an opinion, or hadn't thought about it in the past, which hopefully asking the question makes people think about it. Let's end that poll there, and let's just share the results. So a heavy percentage going with yes. James.
I think a lack of trust is always going to be a problem. I think it has to be. That's one of those things you have to deal with. If it's there, it has to be dealt with, because it's not always there. I've worked in an organization where they were moving to DevOps. They had a very strong head of development. He hired some very smart people. They used to come to my desk and ask me about things. They used to, if they broke things, they'd come and ask me if I'd help them fix them. And there wasn't an element of mistrust. There wasn't an element of neither side would say they'd do something and not do it, or say they hadn't done something when they had. Everyone just got on and behaved well. So you can have that. And if you stray away from that, then there's problems that need to be dealt with in the people. Forget the process and the technology. Sorry if you were expecting to get away without hearing PPT. But the people side of it is very, very important. And you get so many different types of people who choose career in technology. That empathy doesn't, empathizing with someone it's not a weakness from you. It's trying to understand and making sure that we're all getting this right together. But yeah, it has to be worked out, the relationships between these two teams. These teams shouldn't be pitted against each other. They should be together delivering high quality, stable, secure code. So I've been plenty of places where mistrust between where teams, they weren't sort of pitted against each other, but they ended up, the culture in the organization was lots of things are broken, things go wrong all the time, so make sure you've got someone to blame. We don't need to be blamed again because it looks like we broke it. Yeah. You often get that between a firewall team, a server room team, a desktop team, a solutions architects, and a security team. If you got all those different teams in an organization that bits are falling over all the time, and your head of service is never going to get his bonus because he never gets a month without a P1. When you're in that kind of messy situation, it's hard to make sure that there is the trust, but it can be between security developers. I've worked in some organizations where we all got on really well and we did good stuff.
I think it's where you're aiming, isn't it? I the third principle or whatever of DevOps is experimentation and learning, which I often think about as building a trust organization where everyone's in it together and it's all one team. And of course, putting in the silos of I'm going to hire a DevOps team to get developers and operations working together is just anti-pattern. Larry, thoughts?
Yeah. So when I started at Comcast, and my goal was to essentially transform the application security approach to be this developer-centric approach, I was given the policy manual, 300 pages, day one, and I read it, and I was like, wow, if they're, and this is what they're telling customers of and auditors that they do, if they actually are doing even half of this, this is the most advanced cyber application security group I've ever seen. Then I started interviewing the developers and the development teams. And I only talked to maybe a half a dozen development teams in my first 3 or 4 weeks there. And they weren't doing a fraction, like 1% even of that policy manual on a regular, consistent basis. And then I started talking to them sort of about that gap. And they were like, well, they don't trust us and we don't trust them. And so I went and I reported this to the executives back at Comcast about a month in. And I said, the biggest problem we have is a total lack of trust between security and development. And they immediately like, no, we like them, we're here to help. And I'm like, they don't think you are here to help. They think you're wasting their time mostly. And so, well, what could you do about it? Even if it were true, it's not like trust is a formula. And I was like, well, yeah, actually there is a formula for this kind of trust. There's a gentleman by the name of Charles Green who came up with this formula. It's in a book. It's on Amazon called The Trusted Advisor. And basically trust equals credibility plus reliability plus empathy. Actually, I think they call it intimacy, but they mean essentially the same thing as empathy, what James was just talking about, all divided by apparent self-interest. And I don't have time at this point for me to walk through this formula, but if you think about it that way, then you can actually focus on each of the improving each of the terms in the numerator and minimizing the term in the denominator, and that greatly improves the relationships. But it's pretty radical. The things that they sort of naturally want to do, they're not going to want to do, mostly because they don't trust the people that they're speaking to. And so you sort of have to fake it till you make it to a certain degree on trust from the security side.
Yeah, I think it harks to the traditional gatekeeper problem that still exists. Of I'm sitting here and I'm telling you, you've just released some shitty code, excuse my French, because it's got a vulnerability that, how the hell did you do that, sort of thing? And it's a challenging atmosphere as well. Or we've just done a vulnerability scan of this new application you've written, and here's everything that's wrong with it. Wrong approach. Okay, we're running up to time. I think there's barely, not even a minute left. So we've filled up the 2 hours today. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, James. Great talking to you again. Thank you, everybody who's joined in, listened to us. Hopefully you got some nuggets out of that. And thank you all for your participation. Have a great one.
Thanks, everyone.
Good day. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.